I think that's such a cop-out. The rules exist for a reason, and they're not that hard to comply with. Somebody comes in, a safety director, and says there are too many rules. Nobody could ever possibly be expected to follow them. Plenty of trucking companies do. Plenty of large corporations are able to follow these rules and to safely transport goods across the country without killing people.
My name is Jordan Jones. I'm an attorney with Los Angeles Truck Accident Lawyers.
I'm Diana Diskin with Los Angeles Truck Accident Lawyers.
Welcome to Break for Justice.
In this episode, why truck accidents are different.
Diana, question for you. I think I know the answer already, but I'm going to ask it to you anyways. What's the single biggest difference between a truck accident case versus a regular car accident case?
You know, the injuries are so much more devastating in a truck case. We're talking about a vehicle that is far heavier than a normal car and is cruising along on a highway at a relatively high speed. And when that impact occurs, when that wreck occurs, the effects are incredibly devastating for the people who are being hit. So the injuries are more severe. Often we see more wrongful death cases in trucking cases. And the consequences of what has occurred are far more than what we would see in a normal rear end accident, for example.
And what about in terms of like how you handle it? Like, do you handle it the same way as you would as like a car accident, or what do you do differently, if anything?
No, you know, it's totally different because there are so many rules that come into play for truck drivers and for motor carriers and for all of the participants in the transportation chain. We have the federal motor carrier safety regulations that are throughout the country and that mandate all of the safety rules that all of these participants in the transportation cycle are supposed to be following. And so when you have a trucking case, you have to immediately look at those rules because those rules are not the same rules that apply to the normal sedan driver, a person who's just picking up their kid from a soccer game. We're talking about people who are transporting loads, property, for profit, and they have special rules that apply.
I gotcha. Okay. So let me ask you this, because I don't know, I've deposed hundreds of truck drivers and hundreds of safety directors. I know you have as well. And I guess this is really just more for my own curiosity than anything. Like, one of the things that I always hear a lot of these folks say is, I mean, you can't comply with all the rules. I mean, it's impossible, or there's too many rules. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think that's true? Are you buying it? What do you think?
No, I think that's such a cop-out. The rules exist for a reason, and they're not that hard to comply with. There aren't even that many rules. I mean, there are certainly, many rules that exist, but in terms of the number of them and what they're asking for, we're not talking about super high level that needs to be complied with. We're talking about the minimum safety level. So if somebody comes in, a safety director, and says there are too many rules, nobody could ever possibly be expected to follow them. Plenty of trucking companies do. Plenty of large corporations are able to follow these rules and to safely transport goods across the country without killing people.
Yeah. So, it's interesting because you just talked about, you said large corporations, right? And I know you and I, we've litigated against some of the huge, like some of the big boys, but we've also litigated against tons of mom and pops. I mean, probably most of my cases have been against mom and pops that are like 5 trucks or less. A lot of times it's 1 truck, and I don't know. What about for those folks? What are your thoughts in that regard?
You still need to follow the safety regulations, and they're not hard to comply with. Whether you're big or small, those safety regulations exist so that our highways in this country are safe for everybody to travel. Those highways are not just for trucks. They're just not for the transportation of property alone. They're for everybody to be able to enjoy the right of travel.
Yeah. No, yeah, and I agree. And also too, like, the other thing is there's so many resources out there. Like, you can hire essentially like external third party safety departments that'll come in and make sure you're compliant with the regs and that you're properly qualifying people and screening people. I mean, there's third party companies that'll do all your hiring, your driver qualification for you. Because it's tough. I get it. Like, if you're wearing many hats, but to your point, I mean, the safety rules, I mean, they're so important. Like, people get killed if these rules don't get followed. So, I mean, especially this day and age where it's just kind of like literally you can hire third party companies that'll do the whole thing for you. So I don't really think there's an excuse. But also in my mind, and this is just, Jordan Jones, this is just what I think. I think, listen, there's a lot of regs, and I think, not all regs are created equally. And there's some that are like super, super important, like driver qualification, hours of service, vehicle maintenance, because those things, like, somebody's going to get killed if something goes bad with those, right? Then you have some other stuff that's kind of like, paperwork, and, make sure you have your fire extinguisher with you. Like, I mean, those, they're important, but I just feel like, especially if, I don't know, if you're like a small mom and pop out there listening to this, like, lean on those third party resources that are available to you. And like, look, I get it. We all have like time constraints and practical constraints, but like, focus on those really big ones that are going to actually make a difference for safety, out there in the world and on the highway. Diana, you brought up some of the rules and regs, and we've talked about the regulations a little bit here. I said a couple ones that I think are important. What are some that you think are really important?
Well, I think I really love the hours of service regulations, because who doesn't love doing math in the morning? um, and trying to reconstruct a driver's workday. But those are the rules that are one of the rules that are super important, and that really helps us as litigators actually build the picture of the story. What was the driver doing hour by hour, minute by minute? And were those hours of service rules being complied with? Where was the driver? Are those hours of service actually accurate when you look at, they were in city X at such and such hour, and then they're suddenly in city Y, 400 miles away, only an hour later? This helps us to build a story about whether or not the safety regulations are actually being followed, and
Yeah.
whether the motor carrier or whoever it is that we're talking about here is being truthful, and whether they were, working to try to be safe out on the roads.
Yeah. No, and that's a good point that you bring up too. And I know that, what you're describing, that still happens. I mean, I think it's less prevalent now that we switched over to e-logs.
Yeah.
But I still see. I mean, how many motor carriers have you seen where the e-log was broken and they're using the paper, right? So
I think we just had a case, or just got a case recently, where it is a paper log.
yeah.
And so you and I are going to enjoy
Well,
for the
exactly. The logs get quote unquote broken, so this is still circumventing the paper. But
yeah.
I'll tell you another thing we see a lot, and actually this is another case we have going right now, Diana, is the new cheating is unplugging the logs and also messing around with the logins, right? Like, we got the case right now where the team drivers, and they were messing around with each other's things so they could keep driving over hours and look compliant on paper. So I don't know. It's kind of disappointing because I was really hoping that the ELDs were going to fundamentally overhaul, hours of service and make things safer. But I think the reality that we've seen is people still cheat the logs. They're just, how they cheat them now is different, which is really unfortunate.
Well,
But
it's, like what they say, for every new rule, somebody finds a new way to break it.
I like that. For every new
Yeah.
rule, everybody finds a new way to break it. So, and actually, that's kind of a good segue, because the other thing that we wanted to talk about is, evidence and the evidence disappearing. So, in this kind of new frontier with telematics, and by the way, how fast is telematics changing? My gosh,
Every
like,
day.
it's crazy. It's like 12 months ago was totally different from today, and 24 months ago is really almost, it's unrecognizable,
Yeah.
the technology now with AI and everything. But I guess, like, are you doing anything differently? Like, maybe like in the last 12 months, or whatever, the last, call it 24 months. What are you doing differently in terms of evidence preservation in light of all the telematic stuff we have going on?
Yeah, I think that our evidence preservation letters have to be more robust, and we have to constantly be updating them to reflect the latest telematics programs that are out there. So that when we're asking for a company to preserve evidence, if there's somebody out there who's being super literal and we don't have the right thing listed, and they say, well, I guess I don't have to preserve that then. I
Hmm.
want to make sure that our evidence preservation letters are, super premium. And
Yeah. No, yeah, definitely. And then, one thing we started doing too is um, telling the vendors, like, when, because like a lot of the e-logs now are like stored in the cloud with Samsara or with Motive or whomever. And the I don't know if I ever told you this story or not. It's kind of a funny story I like to tell. It wasn't funny at the time, but I had sent out a preservation letter. I said, keep the e-logs, and they just didn't keep them. So we get in litigation, all the logs were gone, and I thought I had, pretty much dead to rights on spoliation, because it was, I sent them a notice, and it was still within the 6 month window, so they had the logs. And I filed my motion for the spoliation instruction, and this was back when I was in Michigan, in Detroit. And the judge, and he said, well, we never had the logs. He said Motive had them. Well, back then they were called Keep Trucking. He goes, Keep Trucking had the logs. The judge goes, yeah, they didn't have the logs. And I said, Judge, it's their vendor. I said, it's their account. They can go in and get them and download them. He said, well, no. Yeah, so they didn't have possession and control. They were with Keep Trucking. So, like I always say, smart people learn from their mistakes, and really smart people learn from the mistakes of others. So in my preservation letter, I started putting in there, like, notify any vendors who may have possession and control of this. And when we find out, this is something Diana and I do, is when we find out who the vendors are, we send them a letter too and say, hey, hold on to this stuff. This may be germane to the litigation.
right.
That stuff goes quick. I mean, a lot of this stuff is 6 months, right?
That's right. I
Yeah.
actually just had an email from a friend the other day who's handling a trucking case, and he told me he was asking for some, sample discovery, and he told me that he had already sent out some general discovery earlier, and the defense had responded, the motor carrier had responded that they didn't have the hours of service logs. And so I was explaining to him about the rule about maintaining it for 6 months, at least 6 months,
Mm-hmm.
and that he could, see what he could find out through depositions of the safety director and of the driver, and see if there's any other way to obtain them. Whether they're being kept by some sort of third party, or whether the company is lying in some fashion. But
Yeah.
yeah, these are super important things.
Yeah, exactly. And some of this other telematic stuff, like, for example, if you have, like, GPS data, or if you have, like a lot of the ELDs are being, now kind of bundled with telematics. So, like, if you have, like, Motive, they have all the AI and they generate the driver reports. I mean, there's no requirement to hold on to that stuff at all, period. You could dump it the next day if you want to, because their regulation just talks about, the hours of service or the substantiating documents. But if you have like an AI generated driver report from Motive, I mean, you don't have to make that under the regs. You don't have to preserve it under the regs. You can dump it the next day. So, it's super important to be diligent about that stuff, and diving into that, finding out the retention period, if it should exist, who the vendors are that have the data, and getting after that. So it's just interesting. It's changed dramatically in the last, even 5 years was totally different than 3 years ago, was totally different than today. So
So, Jordan, you're coming to us from Michigan. You've been out here in California for a few years. Can you talk to us a little bit about what are the differences that you see between other states and California's rules?
yeah, I mean, so California is really weird. It's kind of different. I've litigated trucking cases in a lot, many states, but the majority have been in California and in Michigan. And California is weird because, like, most states have fully adopted the regs. In California, like, I don't know, California always has to be different, and they haven't, like, fully adopted the regs. They've adopted some stuff and not some other parts, and that actually, I think it makes it more difficult in some ways, because, like, you need interstate commerce for the regs to apply. And most states, like in Michigan, actually in every state I've ever litigated in, period, other than California, and that's like, Missouri, Texas, Michigan, Iowa. I got one going in Kansas right now. Like, literally, they have fully adopted the regs, so it applies to, like, intrastate commerce.
Right.
That's not how it is in California, and it's, I don't know why that is. I find that surprising. And also, it's hard because, like, you have a lot of these small motor carriers, and those are the ones that are really unsafe, the chameleon carriers that you see tons and tons of them. And those are the ones that, like, they don't get into interstate commerce, and they're the ones that need regulation the most, in my opinion. So, that's really difficult. And then the other thing here is just, like, the transportation cycle here tends to be a lot more complicated. You have a lot more like smaller carriers that are like subcontracting between one another. And then you have like brokers, but the brokers are like undertaking to transport the load. So now they're looking more like a motor carrier. So it's just like very, like it's like a really complicated system out here, I find. And it's even further compounded because they haven't fully adopted the regs to make it like uniform with what's required nationally and what they do in most other states. So it's very different. It's very different litigating trucking cases out here.
So, Jordan, can you explain who are the players in a typical trucking case? You mentioned, for example, something called a chameleon carrier earlier.
So there's a lot. At a bare minimum, kind of like in a very basic transaction, you're going to see like there's a shipper, the motor carrier, and then the receiver. But in modern logistics, like it's like super complicated. So you might see like freight brokers, very common. Sometimes you'll see like a freight forwarder, which is a little different than a freight broker, kind of similar but a little bit different. You see like other intermediaries, like for example, if you have like a shipping container case, there's a whole other separate thing there. There's all kinds of folks. You see, sometimes I see like subcontractors, or it's like motor carrier will sub out a load to another motor carrier. Sometimes you see two brokers, double brokered load, which you're not supposed to do. And then the really interesting thing too is like we're kind of starting to see like as logistics gets like more integrated, like you start to see like 3PL, 4PL, 5PL, and kind of all these different players that are doing different things like within the transportation stack. Like I know, like for example, there's a company called like Macro Point, and like Macro Point doesn't like directly participate in the load, but they provide like software to like allow for visibility into the load. So like the shipper can see where the load's at, and the receiver can see where the load's at, and the motor carrier, things of that nature. So there's a lot of different folks that are like kind of factoring into the transportation cycle. And I'll tell you what, I think you can also consider to a certain extent like some of the people who aren't necessarily involved in the load, but you have companies like Hire Right, who are doing driver screening, or some of these third parties we were talking about earlier. You have like the AI and the ELD providers, like you have Motive. Like if someone unplugs their ELD and they have unlogged drive time, I mean Motive's supposed to be reporting that to the back end to the motor carrier. So it's kind of like you have this really expansive field and all these people involved, and it's just like making sure that everybody's doing their job and doing what they're supposed to do to get the load there safely. So it's really really blown up and gotten very robust over the years. So all that said, who do you see like in this transportation stack trying to dodge liability?
Everybody, all the time, but probably within that stack of players, probably the broker
Yeah,
is the one who is trying the hardest to
yeah,
get out of this little game. And they love to use preemption as their
yeah.
main argument. I'm not a motor carrier. Those rules don't apply to me. I didn't have anything to do with anything. I just made sure that the load got to a motor carrier. So usually the brokers are the ones who are trying to get out of the liability argument the most.
What about on the control side too? Like because brokers, you kind of go after them, to active negligence and vicarious liability, like agency control. What about on the control side? What are you seeing from that aspect from the brokers?
Well, they want to get out of the idea of negligent selection. Um,
Sure.
and they certainly don't want to have anything to do with the idea that they had anything to do with control of how the load was transported,
Hmm.
or the timing of any of it. And so that's generally what they're arguing to get out of.
Yeah. Well, it's
Kind of.
just yeah, it's just so crazy. Like, and it's total BS because like. To me, on the one hand, you have these brokers, and a lot of them, like especially the smaller motor, they don't even work for anybody else. You have like these companies, and they're 100% of their business is Amazon, for example, right? And it's like Amazon gives them like the pickup and delivery time. They give them the location. They give them the instructions. They talk directly to these people. They're, if they stop, they're tracking the load. They stop. They call them and say, "Why you stopped? What are you doing?" The brokers are telling them where to stop, where they're allowed to stop, where they're not allowed to stop, because they have TVs and they don't want them stopping in this neighborhood, but you can stop in this neighborhood for your rest break. So like the brokers are kind of like controlling, in my opinion, they're really controlling everything. But then they're like, well, hold on, you're independent contractors and we can't hire you and we can't fire you and we can't do this. Well, sure, maybe they can't like hire and fire the truck driver, but here's what they can do. They can say, hey, you're not taking loads anymore, which is in effect firing them. so so I don't know. I just think the whole control thing is just a total fallacy, but I don't know, maybe I'm jaded, who knows. Yeah.
So speaking of controls, how do
Yeah.
you usually figure out who is actually controlling the driver or the truck?
Yeah, so especially with the big brokers, like it's the contract, because the contract on one side it says, well, we don't control anything. You have control over the means, method, manner of the services. But on the other hand, it says, but you have to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. In violation of any one of these clauses is grounds to terminate this contract. Right? So it's kind of like it's the contract, but I think where you really find like the smoking guns is like in the communications, because like I've had cases where like I had a case, the motor carrier didn't even know their driver was on the load. Like he literally did not know, like it's, his company, quote unquote, but his driver was like got a load directly from the broker. The broker was communicating with them fully. The broker had all the visibility into the load, gets in the wreck. And literally the first time the motor carrier found out he was even on the load was when they got notified about the wreck. So I think that's where the smoking gun is. You're looking in the communications, like who's telling the driver where to go and how to make this delivery. Is it the motor carrier or is it the broker? Right. So
Right.
that's what I like to look at, but everyone does it a little differently.
Yeah,
So
and we've got a case going on like that right now, where the motor carrier is claiming that they had absolutely no idea that
yeah,
the driver was transporting this load, which is strange because, of course, the driver was driving their truck. But
right. But I on the other side of that, I think that's good for the agency and control aspect against the brokers, right? And also I think to a certain degree the shippers too. A little bit of a different animal, but yeah, I mean it happens all the time. And again, it's just modern logistics, and it's kind of shameful because I think what the big brokers have done. As you can probably tell, I'm not the biggest fan of freight brokers, but I think what the brokers have done is they figured out a way to make like huge ultra profitable trucking companies, but they call it something else. So you have all the upside and none of the downside, because you don't have any of the regulatory compliance issues that you have with a motor carrier. You don't have the hiring, qualification, training restrictions that you have. And then when a wreck happens, they argue they don't have vicarious liability. That's preemption, to your point,
right,
right?
right.
So they've really figured out a way to dupe the system, and it's unfortunate because they leave the truck drivers holding the bags,
Well, that's
and meanwhile they're making bags and bags and bags of cash, right?
yeah, yeah. It's kind of incredible because who they're really duping is the motor carrier.
Yeah.
Motor carriers depending on these logistics companies or these brokers to get them jobs. This
Hmm.
is a middleman who's getting all of the profit without any of the problems.
Yeah, exactly. So I'd love to see something done, like legislatively. I'm not terribly optimistic, but who knows? Who knows what's going to happen? But yeah, and we kind of hit on this a little bit earlier in terms of like telematics, black box, maintenance records. I mean, beyond the obvious. I mean, if you have a maintenance record and you have a maintenance issue, it's kind of apparent how you're going to use the maintenance record, but how are you, like some of the outside of the box stuff, like that you may see with like telematics or EDR data, how are you using that in your cases now?
Well, just generally speaking, first of all, there's an obstacle in terms of getting it. A lot of these companies, claim that they don't have it anymore, or they didn't have it, or they don't know how to get it. But once you actually start getting those materials, again, this goes to building the story of where the driver was, when, what were they doing, what was that vehicle doing, and how did it ultimately end up in the wreck that you're litigating. And so all of these records are incredibly important because they help to paint this picture of what's happening. Your black box or EDR records are going to help tell you how that vehicle was operating at any moment. The telematics are going to help you talk about where, when, what, and those maintenance records are going to tell you about the health of the vehicle, whether, for example, brake lights were working, whether reverse lamps were working, whether, various parts, brakes and pumps and things like that were properly inspected and were
Mhm.
properly working. These are rules that the motor carriers are meant to be following. They're supposed to be doing pre and post trip inspections, and those are supposed to be getting documented so that the health of the vehicle is always documented.
Yeah, yeah. No, yeah, and super important. And the challenge is a lot of times getting that stuff. And here's the other challenge too. It's like, especially with some of the bigger companies that maybe have like a couple thousand trucks, where they have the. I mean, look, if you have like a small mom and pop, they're not using like the Motive AI smart drive technology. Like, just like you have like an owner operator. He's not going to have like some big like Linux AI stack, right? But when you see those kind of bigger motor carriers that have, a couple thousand trucks, whatever, that's where you see those. But like the challenge is like figuring out like what do they even have, because it's like it's a la carte and you kind of pick and choose what you want. So I mean, one thing we started doing, this is relatively recently, is in discovery requesting billing records from the vendors, and I've yet to have anybody give me those voluntarily. I've had to argue that a few times, and like I've won it, I've lost it. But it's nice, it's helpful because you can kind of see at least like what they had and what information should be out there available. Because otherwise, I mean, we have no way to know,
Well,
right?
no,
So
and the
yeah,
really, back to your point about a la carte selection there, those records are incredibly illuminating as to what was available for them to choose, how much
yeah,
it would have cost, and the fact that they chose not to get it. And
yeah.
usually the cost is not, terribly prohibitive considering how many miles are being driven.
Oh,
And, you know, if you think
yeah.
about it like that.
No,
What do you,
absolutely.
yeah. And so let me ask you a question. And I haven't necessarily seen it happen, but in any of my cases, but I imagine you have.
Yeah.
What do you do when a black box is missing or when it's been overwritten?
Oh, that happens a lot. Not as much as it used to, but
Yeah.
it still happens pretty frequently. But I mean, like black, number one, it depends on like what the black box is, right? If you have a Detroit diesel engine, you're going to get way more information versus like a Volvo. A Volvo is incredibly hard to download. I literally think there's two companies in the entire United States of America who can download Volvo trucks. So as a practical matter, in all your Volvo cases, the black box is going to be missing as a practical matter. But I think that's where we, going back to like all this other stuff. I mean, historically, like the main things that I've looked at black box data for is speed and braking activity,
Yeah.
and cruise control as well.
Right.
But you can get speed now from like the ELD a lot of time. Like if they have a lytics camera, it has a speed in it. I know Motive has the capability of tracking the speed, so does Samsara. And you don't necessarily get like the braking activity per se, because on the EDR, like it'll say like brake and it literally says like on or off. You can like look and see if they're braking or not, but you can still kind of tell like from looking at like if they have a dash cam video or some of the ELD or GPS data, you can kind of see like when the speeds start changing to kind of get that indication of braking. So I mean, I kind of supplement it in that way. But I'll tell you what though, in modern trucking, if I have to pick one or the other and choose one, either you have the telematics information or the black box data. I think I'm picking the telematics these days. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's my opinion. I don't know. What do you think? If you have to pick one or the other, pick your poison.
I think if it came down to it, I'd probably pick telematics,
Okay.
but I do still like that crash data recorder.
Oh, I like to have them both. Don't get me
Still,
wrong.
still enjoy
but
that.
yeah, I just when the telematics is gone, I guess like there's not really a good substitute for it. At least not that I know of. Whereas versus black box, like if that data is gone, you can supplement. You can kind of figure it out
You can
through the
still do
telemet.
things. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Or just traditional, get an accident reconstructionist out there and start, taking, skid mark measurements and things of that nature, or the police. So yeah, yeah.
They're
And
just
then
trucking litigation that existed before CDR. So
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So Diana, awesome thing. Our community is growing. There's tons and tons and tons of new lawyers and older lawyers who maybe haven't had a lot of exposure to trucking, getting into trucking now, which is great because I really do sincerely believe high tides raise all ships, and I really do feel like collectively we can make the industry be safer. And I think we have. I think that's why we're seeing the proliferation of all this telematics stuff, because people want to avoid accidents and root out and identify problem drivers before they become a problem practically. But all that said, so for some of the folks who are newer in our community, what are some of the mistakes that you're seeing inexperienced lawyers make on the plaintiff's bar?
yeah, I think just on the most basic level, thinking that this is just a case against the truck driver. It's
Okay.
not. You have multiple levels of corporate involvement. There's going to be the motor carrier, there's going to be the broker, there's going to be the shipper potentially. All of these different layers have to be investigated. You need to be naming all of these folks. And if you can't figure out who all of these folks are at the very beginning, that's okay. Give yourself plenty of room with all of your DOE defendants. Make sure that you've got like those 1 through 50 named in your complaint. That way you can add them in later. Because I can guarantee you that in virtually every single trucking case, it's going to be more than the truck driver and it's going to be more than the motor carrier that's out there. You're going to find other defendants, other players in this picture. And you need to make sure that you are looking for them and that you're thoroughly investigating what role they had to play in this wreck.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And also understanding what they did wrong too. And I agree with you. I think the biggest mistake everybody makes when they're newer in trucking is not understanding the transportation cycle and not understanding the players who are involved. And it's like one thing to like identify. So like say you identify a broker, right? And you say, hey, there was a broker and here's another potential defendant. And they say, well, look, we think we should be preempted, but we're not anyways because they had a satisfactory safety rating and they weren't in alert status. And people go, oh, okay. I mean, that's not the end of the story. I mean, or here's another one. I mean, most motor carriers in the United States of America are unrated. Like it's like the overwhelming, it's like 90% plus do not have a safety rating one way or the other. So, you have these unrated motor carriers and they go, oh, they're not in alert status. Well, listen, if they have one truck and one trailer, I mean, how often are they getting inspected?
That's
Right.
exactly it. I think a lot
Yeah.
of people
So
really don't understand how to read those records on the DOT and Safer website. They don't understand
yeah.
that when it says zero, the rating is zero because they haven't ever been inspected. That doesn't mean that this is a safe trucking company. It just means that they were never inspected.
Right, exactly. And it's like and the other thing too is like, they look at like out of service percentages. Like you generally don't get ordered out of service for driver violations. So you need to be looking at like the basic score and like seeing what the basic score is versus because I mean, listen, you can have a really bad basic score and have 0% for out of service for driver violations because you're, generally not ordered out of service for that. So yeah, you're right. It's like it's not even like understanding how to like read it, but understanding like what it means. Like I'm sure you can read it and say, "Oh, they've never been ordered out of service." I mean, it's not rocket science, but understanding like why that is and like what does that mean within the larger context of things and understanding that. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that's the biggest mistake that folks are making. So
Thanks for listening to Break for Justice. Visit us online at trucklawyers.com.